From The Conversation, this is Politics with Michelle Grattan.
Gambling is a policy area where there is a mismatch between the public and the government. Basically, the public want much more restriction put on gambling advertising, while the government, beset with pressure from stakeholders, including the industry itself and media companies wanting the revenue from advertising, is dragging its feet. The federal government currently has legislation before Parliament that would make a number of changes. It would restrict the number of ads that can be played during certain hours, ban radio ads during school pick-up and drop-off times, and also ban ads in sports venues and on players' uniforms. But critics say the legislation, which is now before a Senate inquiry, doesn't go nearly far enough. To discuss why the government might be so reluctant to move robustly on this issue and what more can and should be done, we're joined today by longtime gambling reform advocate and independent MP Andrew Wilkie. Andrew Wilkie, the government claims its proposed reforms are the furthest that any federal government has gone. Is this in fact a big step in the right direction or a limited sop to public pressure?
Michelle, I think any reform for the better is to be applauded. And to that end, the reforms by the previous coalition government, built on by the current Labor government, things like banning credit cards for gambling. I mean, they're all positives. But to your question, is it more theatre than substance to appease the community? I think it is more theatre than substance. Remember, the environment here is the government's been sitting on the 31 recommendations of the Murphy Gambling Harm Report for over 3 years. And all up, only 3 of those 31 recommendations have been or are being implemented, and even then only in part. So I think that's all the evidence the community needs, that the government's not fair dinkum about strong, deep reform that will genuinely have a big impact on reducing the rate of gambling addiction.
So do you think that Murphy parliamentary review still holds up? And just briefly, what should the government be doing that it's not doing now in this legislation?
Look, I think it needs to be recognised that the Murphy parliamentary inquiry, named after Peter Murphy, the late chair, was the best parliamentary inquiry into gambling harm this parliament has ever seen. And it's important that its 31 recommendations were a consensus report. They're consensus recommendations from a committee that had Labor, it had Coalition, it had independents. For there to be such an effective inquiry and to have such support across the parliament is very important. I would go so far as to say it is the best blueprint that has ever been produced in Australia for addressing gambling harm. And that makes the fact that the government sat on it for more than 3 years all the more damning. That makes the fact that the government is only going to 3 of the recommendations and then only in part, I think that's all the more damning. It's clearly well short of what the community were hoping for. Let's not forget that, depending on the survey, but around about 70%, maybe more, 75% of people polled want a complete ban on gambling advertising. And in that regard, the government's current reforms are not implementing a ban. They're going to ban some things around the margins, but there'll still be 3 gambling ads an hour all day from 6 a.m. to 8:30 p.m. The only blackout would be during play itself with one of the broadcast games, say NRL or AFL. The government can't tell me, it can't look the community in the face and say it's okay for children to watch 3 gambling ads an hour. I mean, this is so far removed from the Murphy recommendation that ads be phased out over several years and ultimately there be a complete ban on broadcast and online media. I mean, there's not even a patch on that. No wonder people are very critical, especially members of the crossbench of the parliament.
It's very hard to exactly get to the bottom of this, why the government and indeed other governments so resistant to going further. What do you think is the cause? Now, the government points to the effect that the loss of revenue would have on local media, on free-to-air television, but that doesn't really seem an adequate explanation. How much pressure do you think the gambling industry itself can exert? And on this question of the media, how much pressure do you think the media has brought to bear?
Well, there's no doubt that the gambling companies have for decades applied great pressure to whoever is in power. Some listeners would recall way back in my first term from 2010 to 2013 where the poker machine industry waged a fierce campaign against the Gillard government to stop the poker machine reforms that I had an agreement with for the government for my support. That was a fascinating insight into the power of the poker machine industry. But of course, the industry these days is bigger and more diverse, and the online and sports betting companies wield their own power. I think that helps to explain my original, perhaps overly simplistic explanation that this was all about the government being scared stiff of the gambling companies and the media companies, and I would add the major sporting codes. I think the explanation is actually more complex than that. I think there are some in the government who are fellow travellers with one or all of those industries. And I'd single out the Prime Minister personally and his relationship with the leadership of NRL. I mean, that's not a case of the Prime Minister being scared of anyone in the NRL. He's just favourably disposed to the leadership of the NRL. I would also add two other layers, Michelle. One is this is demonstrating a fundamental lack of humanity on the part of the decision makers in the government. I don't know how any member of the House or senator can sit down and have the sort of meetings that I have regularly with people who are battling addiction or recovering from addiction, families of who have a loved one who has an addiction, perhaps maybe even suicided. I don't know how anyone with humanity can have those conversations and not walk away absolutely determined to do something about it. And I'll add a fourth layer to this, and that is the opposition. When you have a government and an alternative government with broadly similar policies, it's easy for them both to get away with inaction. And I think up until recently, the leadership of the federal opposition haven't really understood this issue, haven't understood the politics of it, I would add, haven't understood that here is an issue where they could differentiate themselves from the government, which would be immensely popular. It would be seen to be very much a policy in the public interest. But I don't think the opposition leader personally, I don't know that the Shadow Minister, Sarah Henderson, have really understood the politics of this. But I think that is changing. We've seen now in a couple of votes on the floor of the House where a couple of opposition backbenchers have peeled away and voted with the crossbench. I know there's some very active opposition members, and I'll give a shout out to Simon Kennedy here, who took over from Scott Morrison. He's been really good on this, and he's been lobbying his backbenchers a lot. So I'm hopeful that by the end of this 8-week Senate inquiry into the bill, that we will see the opposition side with the Greens and demand at least some significant changes to the bill. Maybe that's why the government have gone in so soft at the start, so they've got a bit of room to move with amendments when it comes to getting the Senate's support for it. Amendments like having a national regulator, an independent national regulator, instead of this nonsense at the moment where mainly the Northern Territory, but in the future also the Tasmanian state governments, tiny governments with weak regulators, inadequate resources are regulating what really is a national industry.
This battle over gambling advertising does bring to mind the one over cigarette advertising. Do you think it's been a harder battle to fight than that earlier one?
I think it has evolved from the days of the tobacco advertising ban in that now there is so much more media. To be fair to them, it is harder for the commercial free-to-air TVs to make a buck with their advertising. Advertisers can spend their budget across all sorts of technologies. So it has been a more difficult commercial environment for the TV stations. But that shouldn't give them license to continue to base a business model on activities that aren't in the public interest. I mean, just as we decided in the 70s and 80s that advertising on free-to-air of tobacco products was harmful, was not in the national interest, and ultimately was banned, we should be thinking the same thing about gambling advertising these days. And by the way, although I've cut the TV companies a bit of slack, I'm not going to cut them too much slack because these are the same companies that said back in the 70s and 80s that getting rid of tobacco advertising would be the end of cricket in Australia. I mean, for heaven's sakes, what silly things to be saying. And now some of these companies are saying it'll be the end of free-to-air TV or it'll even be the end of community sport. It's just not the case. Of course, there will need to be alternative sources of revenue for these companies, but that was part of the real value of the Murphy report. It wasn't going to be an immediate ban. It was going to be phased in over several years, which would allow the TV stations to adjust and evolve their business model. And they're all, look, I'd be happy to see some government intervention here, some government assistance during the transition phase. And I'll just put it out there, maybe a micro tax on every bet that's laid, a fraction of a cent, grossed it up. And you'd probably find it wouldn't be that hard to come up with the support for the TV stations that they currently enjoy from the ads. It's hard to get an exact figure, but it's somewhere between $100 and $200 million a year in gambling advertising for the TV stations, plus the print media, of course. My paper down here in Hobart, the Mercury, some days it's just full of gambling ads. And regardless of what you think of gambling per se, regardless how concerned you might be for the harm it causes, you might at least care about your enjoyment of reading the newspaper or watching the telly and just being bombarded by ads constantly.
Now, last week, the Prime Minister seemed to shift the issue to the states. He said on radio that he was not against, quote, someone having a punt, unquote, but that the focus should be on problem gambling, and that overwhelmingly, he said, is caused by poker machines. Now, these are controlled by the states. Do you think the focus should be on poker machines? And are the states resisting action?
Well, I think the Prime Minister should be more honest with the community because when he says, he favours everyone being able to have a punt, that's thinly disguised code for people like Andrew Wilkie and Tim Costello want to stop gambling, which is not the case. I'm quite happy for people to go out and gamble. I'll enjoy scratching a scratchy myself and see if I won $5. Except for a very small group of activists, we are not anti-gambling. We just want to make it safe. We want to have effective harm minimisation measures in place. So just to clear that up front. Now, as far as what he also said about it's pokies are the problem, again, thinly disguised code for online and sports betting isn't the problem. Again, that's misleading because we know that the uptake in sports and online gambling, it's a very steep line. And with that, the number of people who are either have an addiction or are at serious risk of developing addiction, that number is growing steeply. And in fact, that's reflected in some figures from the Australian Gambling Research Centre last year. They did a survey they looked at thousands of people between 2019 and 2024, so over a 5-year period until just quite recently. And they found that the percentage of people in the community, adults, who are gambling has risen from 57% to 65%. Now, that ain't with pokies. The poker machine industry has reached a bit of a steady state, and I suspect that over coming decades it'll start to decline. The Australian Gambling Research Centre also found that the 18 to 24 age group are nearly twice as likely to be at a high risk of gambling harm compared with other age groups. Well, that's not poker machines, that's sports betting and online gambling. In fact, I'll spare you all the figures, Michelle, but the last one I'll take from that research was that the number of Australians who had experienced gambling-related harm during that period was as much as 3 million Australians and markedly up from the 2019 figure. So something is happening here in the community, and it ain't scratchies or lotto or horse racing or pokies. It is the emergence of a new and very popular form of gambling. Hence, we have to be so careful to be right on top of it. To Anthony Albanese's point that poker machines are a state responsibility, well, yes, they are. And that's not to say the federal government shouldn't be more active in that space. As I learned in my first term when I had to deal with Julia Gillard's for poker machine reform, it was quickly understood that the federal government has levers to interfere in the poker machine space. For example, the Corporations Act or the tax powers. That's two ways in which the federal government can intervene in poker machine industry, which is all the more necessary because the states are actually conflicted. They get so much revenue from poker machines. They have a conflict of interest, and it's fairly it's self-evident why they don't want to crack down too hard on the poker machine industry. In fact, here in Tasmania, the gambling regulator regulates poker machines. It sits within the Treasury, which is all the evidence you need that state governments see poker machines as a source of revenue, not as a public health issue to be dealt with as a public health issue. It's also just a quick aside, Michelle. When the Grants Commission does the GST distribution around the country to each state, it doesn't include poker machine tax revenue in the gross revenue of each state when it looks at the fiscal imbalances between the states. So in other words, poker machines are just absolutely gold, and you can see why places like New South Wales are so determined to protect them.
Now, you mentioned the Gillard government. This battle on gambling has been a long fight for you. You had an agreement with that government and you were dudded. Can you tell us what happened?
Well, I was elected in 2010 from third place on primaries, but I enjoyed a remarkable preference flow and just won the seat. It was called Denison, of course, in 2010. Now it's now been renamed to Clark. And I found myself as one of the 6 crossbenchers that the government and the opposition came to for support because, of course, Julia Gillard won 72 seats, Tony Abbott won 72 seats. And because it was a 150-seat parliament at the time, either Julia Gillard or Tony Abbott had to get 4 of the 6 to support them for supply and confidence. And eventually 4 of us did support Julia Gillard. There was Tony Windsor, Rob Oakeshott, Adam Bant and myself. So the 4 of us gave support to Julia Gillard for supply and confidence that she was able to continue as Prime Minister after the 2010 election. We all had our different deals and arrangements with Julia. My agreement with Julia Gillard was, I think, 8 typed pages, but 2 of the flagship issues was a significant health funding boost for Tasmania and that there be a national, what was called a pre-commitment card for all poker machine players in Australia, where all poker machine players would, in a lucid moment when they were away from machines, would set their daily loss limit. And to gamble, they'd have to put this card with your identity into the slot. And when the machine saw that you had reached your daily limit that you'd set yourself, it would stop you gambling for the rest of the day. And because in all the jurisdictions, all the machines are networked, you'd effectively be blocked or locked out of all the machines in that state. So that was all good. And about halfway through that term, Julia Gillard met with me and said the government would not or could not honour that deal for a mandatory pre-commitment card nationally, and that instead they would continue with a trial looking to eventually have a voluntary pre-commitment card. That was such an egregious breach of her deal with me, her contract with me, that I withdrew support halfway through that term. And Julia Gillard survived because she'd had the good sense to, a couple of months earlier, poach Peter Slipper and get him to accept the role of Speaker, which gave them one extra seat, I suppose, just in case they thought I might withdraw my support. Although I don't think they did think I'd withdraw my support. I think they thought, oh no, he'll roll over. But I had to do what I said I'd do. So, and then that was the like a real flash in the fry pan of poker machine reform nationally, and it's been very hard to get any interest at the federal level ever since.
It must have been pretty disillusioning for you about the political process also.
It was very disappointing, even upsetting. I mean, I had no political experience. I went in expecting the best of everyone. But at some point during those 18 months, the government was clearly not being honest with me when they were talking about the progress and where we're getting to. I'll admit up front, if I had my time again, I would do it differently. I would insist on a very tight deadline with milestones early on in that very first year. Mind you, I was quickly learning about politics, and it seemed to me that it would be harmful for Julia Gillard not to honour the deal, because the polling showed in every state, including New South Wales, there was majority support for poker machine reform. So it would have been a good opportunity, just like Angus Taylor now with online and sports betting. It would have been a good opportunity for Julia Gillard to show that she was a person of good character. Her government had integrity. They would act in the public interest. They would honour a contract with someone. But of course, Julia Gillard came under immense pressure from the industry, and I assume also probably the New South Wales right. And she feared for her prime ministership, and so withdrew from the deal. But of course, as it turned out, Michelle, she was toppled anyway by Kevin Rudd the following year, and they lost the following landslide in an election to Tony Abbott. So it's not like their grand strategy to dump Wilkie did them any good. It ended in tears for them anyway, and we can only speculate what might have happened in 2013 if she had stared down the industry and had stared down the factions and shown herself to be a strong person, of principle. I think she would have been rewarded to some degree, at least at the ballot box.
Now, of course, you don't have any deals with this government, but how do you find them to operate with?
I think I've got a head start on some of my crossbench colleagues in that I've been around a while. So I know the main players probably better than some of my colleagues. I have a bit more of almost a personal relationship with some of them. For example, in my first term, of course, Anthony Albanese was the manager of government business. So I dealt with him every day for 3 years. So I think I've got a reasonably good relationship, but of course, which gives me access, and I think I've got a reasonable reputation nationally. And so the government, I think, likes to have my imprimatur for controversial policies. I note that when the brief came out for parliamentarians on the capital gains tax changes, they singled out a comment from me in the government brief that I had said good on the government finally having a crack on the housing situation. But I'm not going to kid myself. At the end of the day, it's all about numbers. It's harder to get noticed when a government's on 94 seats. Although if the polling's to be believed, the last election could well have been a power-sharing parliament. Even the next election could be a power-sharing parliament. So you sense that the government and the ministers, they try and they try and sideline us as much as they can, but they also, I sense, try and keep us a bit on the hook in case they need us in the future.
Do you talk to the Prime Minister much?
From time to time. I don't need to talk to him as regularly as I used to do in other parliaments. Remembering this is my sixth parliament, and one of them was a power-sharing parliament, and I think 3 of them were within a couple of seats. So I've always been in the game. I know if I was to shoot the PM a text now, he'd be good enough to get straight back to me, which is good. I think it's good that the crossbench, and by the way, I don't mean to be sounding like I'm big nutting myself. I think many of my crossbenchers have a good relationship. The crossbench in the House are an exceptional group of people. In fact, I'll go so far as to say you put any one individual on the crossbench up against anyone else in the chamber, and they'd hold their own or do better. It's an exceptional group of crossbenchers at the moment.
Well, of course, you're more left-leaning than the Teals, or at least most of the Teals. How much do you cooperate with the other crossbenchers, including but not only the Teals? And just finally, what do you think of this effort by a couple of the Teals to run a new party?
My experience with the crossbench is we come together when our interests overlap, and then we dissipate after that point in time. So there'll be times when I'll be sitting next to Bob Catter or the Greens or Allegra Spender, and there'll be times when I'll be sitting on the opposite side of the chamber. And I think you'll see that among all of my colleagues. We are all, including the Teals, are quite independent. And I think the criticism that the Teals were a de facto party, I don't think that was actually fair to the Teals. The fact is that among the so-called Teals have a lot of common concerns and common views of the world. So hence they tend to often vote together, but not always. But it's not because they're a party, it's just that they have similar views of the world. Their electorates are mostly similar. So yeah, I think we're all fiercely independent. And what do I make of this new political party, Community Strong Australia? Look, all strength to them. It's going to be very interesting to see how that evolves and what their communities think of them. I'm not surprised that it has attracted just the 2 of them, and that all the other crossbenchers, and in particular the Teals, are keeping it at arm's length for now. I mean, micro parties, minor parties, major parties, the more the better. The more ways for people in the community to have someone to give them voice. I'll be fascinated to see what Allegra's and Zali's community make of it. I tell you the big advantage it gives them, though. As a party, they are allowed to spend a lot more money than a non-party candidate. So that will allow them to have much richer election campaigns. But how they manage that tension between, I was elected as independent because you wanted an independent, and I've been fiercely independent ever since until now that I'm in a party. What their communities make of it remains to be seen.
Andrew Wilkie, thank you for joining the podcast. We'll be watching your efforts with interest to try to get some more concessions on this legislation. That's all for today's podcast. Thank you to my producer, Ben Roper. We'll be back with another interview soon, but goodbye for now.
Production by Ben Roper. Theme music by Lee Rosevere. The Conversation is a not-for-profit media organisation. Sign up to our daily newsletter for evidence-based news and analysis, including articles from Michelle Grattan, or listen to more of our shows wherever you get your podcasts.